On this show, we'll be talking about something many of us take for granted: water.
It is a basic human right.
What lessons were learned following the Flint, Michigan water crisis? And why are there still so many people in the US who don't have access to clean water? And it isn't just the water from our taps. We'll be looking at why so many rivers and bays are polluted and how to solve such a wide-scale problem. Here in New York, The Square starts now. Welcome to Times Square. I'm Sally Ihan. On this show, we'll be talking about the issue of clean water in America. And we want to hear your opinions. You can send us your questions and comments on Twitter and Facebook at TRT World and be part of the conversation. Now, the Flint, Michigan water crisis began in 2014. It was a story of negligence and led to a federal state of emergency being declared, nearly 80 lawsuits and 15 criminal indictments. But have any lessons been learned from those events? First, let's take a look back at Flint and at the situation now. The story of Flint, Michigan came down to one thing: human rights. In 2014, the drinking water source was switched from the Detroit system to the Flint River to save money. Inadequate testing and treatment of the water led to serious health issues for Flint residents, including dangerous levels of lead, which affects the kidneys, heart and nervous system. 12 people died from Legionnaire's disease. A public health state of emergency was declared. By the end of the crisis, there were 79 lawsuits and 15 criminal indictments, some of which are ongoing.
5 years on since Flint, Michigan, what has America learned?
We hoped that when the Flint water crisis reached the national level, that people would take our water problem seriously, that there would be federal action to prevent another Flint water crisis. Unfortunately, we haven't seen that action happen yet. And we're not sure how many more Flints we'll need before the federal government steps up and passes a bill like the Water Act to fully fund our water systems and make sure that everyone has access to safe water in their home.
Tainted tap water hasn't just been a problem in Flint. 18 million people in America are served by water systems with lead violations. 6 million lead service lines are still in use across America. In 2015, nearly 21 million people relied on water systems that violated health-based quality standards. And children in at least 4 million US households are exposed to high levels of lead. Authorities across America say they're working to ensure all water is clean and claim that progress is being made. But it's 2019 and America is one of the richest countries on the planet. So why are there still problems with access to clean drinking water? I'd like to bring in two of my guests today. Anna Clark is the author of The Poison City, Flint's Water and the American Urban Tragedy, and she joins us from Detroit, Michigan. And in Tucson, Arizona, we have Robert Glennon. He's a professor of law and public policy and the author of Unquenchable, America's Water Crisis and What to Do About It. Welcome to you both. Now let's first talk about Flint. Anna, here we are, half a decade on. Is the Flint water crisis a thing of the past?
Well, very much no. I mean, there's a lot of unresolved questions. On a very technical level, the damaged pipes in Flint's water system are still in the process of being replaced. That's one reason why many people in the city will tell you that they don't yet trust the water that comes out of their taps. And, you know, there's also the larger questions about the court cases that are going to take, I think, years to play out, as well as just the health consequences.
Flint is a small city, but with a very rich history. It was once thriving. It was home to General Motors, but now jobs haven't been replaced and the population has halved since the 1960s. Was the city already in a crisis before the water crisis?
The water crisis before the water crisis was one of affordability. The water rates in the city of Flint were the highest in the entire country. And this is true even before we get to the fact that the population of Flint is disproportionately poor. One of the reasons those water rates were so expensive is because you had less than half the people shouldering the burden of a water system built for when the population was not only twice as big, but also supporting a huge number of General Motors plants.
The Michigan Civil Rights Association released a report in 2017 saying that what happened in Flint was a result of systematic racism. What do you say to this?
To answer that, you can't get away from America's history of infrastructure inequality, which is one of racism, one of segregation, when we literally divided people up geographically, and the places where communities of color were concentrated were communities that, on the bottom line, had homes that were less valued. And while we've had a number of triumphant laws to address that, you can just look around us and to see how the patterns of this inequality is still playing out today, most egregiously in the form of this water crisis in Flint.
Okay, Anna, we'll have to leave it there. Now let's go to Robert Gleason in Arizona. Robert, let's just talk about the sort of broader national perspective here. Is America in a water crisis?
Yes, America is in a water crisis, both in terms of quality and in terms of quantity, especially in terms of quantity. There are literally rivers in the United States that no longer reach the ocean because they are diverted by upstream cities and farmers.
And who are the most vulnerable here? Is it as simple as, the city wins and the rural folk lose out, or is it more complex than that?
I think it's more complicated than that. Across the country, rural Kentucky, rural Texas, are places where the water isn't adequate. There are people who are losing both in the cities and in the rural areas, Sally. And Flint, of course, is a largely minority community, but there are rural white communities in Texas and Kentucky that also do not have adequate water supplies.
Okay, I want to pick up on your point there about these issues that are affecting lower income families. I went to Baltimore to talk to residents there about the cost of water and why it's leaving many families at breaking point.
The water crisis in Flint, Michigan shares a common theme with the struggles of those in Baltimore, Maryland. It's the most vulnerable who are affected. The poverty rate in Baltimore is 24%, double the national rate, and more than 60% of the city is African American. But here it's not about the quality of water, but rather the cost of using it.
Well, there's three main reasons why water affordability is a growing national crisis. One is that our climate is changing. It's stressing water supplies, and major rain events are overburdening sewer systems. Our systems are aging. Some are more than 100 years old, and cities have to rebuild these systems to make sure they're providing safe water. Water affordability is a growing crisis. Federal funding is no longer there. Back in 1977, federal funding peaked. And since then, it's fallen 74%. Baltimore has great water. People don't have to worry about drinking their tap water in Baltimore. The issue in Baltimore is that our infrastructure is aging, like many cities across the country. We need to make more than $1 billion in improvements to our water and sewer system because our water infrastructure needs are growing so much. The city is having to raise water prices on people to pay for these projects. They're necessary projects. It's just that water bills are regressive, and so low-income households are struggling to keep up.
The Environmental Protection Agency says more than $700 billion is needed to maintain and upgrade the nation's infrastructure in the next 20 years. And they say the Trump administration endorsed $2.8 billion for drinking water infrastructure loans. I've come to meet Janet. She's lived in Baltimore her whole life and watched the water bills steadily climb.
It's like a bill that you can never catch up on. And so, now they are stating they're not going to take people's homes for the large bills, but who wants to have a bill that you can't afford to pay?
Does it change the way you think about it?
It doesn't change the way that I use water because I'm going to be charged a specific amount. I don't use more. Somebody that has like 5 people in the house will probably use more water than myself. I live alone, so I'm not using a lot of water. I have to pay just as much as someone, has a household full of people. So I just paid like $900 like about 2 months ago, and I was so surprised when I looked up and saw that it was like 600 or something now.
So why has it gone up so quickly?
Because, it's paced at, this is $80 a month, sometimes it's $100 a month, and that's, paying from $80 to $100 a month. That's like, $1,200 a year.
So you're struggling to pay that?
So it's a lot to pay, yeah.
Does something have to fall over to pay your water bill, or vice versa?
My savings, no savings.
Yeah. What are you hoping to save for?
Retirement. I'm old.
Yeah.
I'm getting close to it.
In talking to Janet, it's clear that this is not just a water crisis. This is a personal crisis, where people feel they have no choice but to pay a bill they say they have no control over. And their savings, their future, are at stake.
For Pastor Mark James, his past is just as valuable as his future. This church was passed down from his grandfather to his mother, and finally to him. But a few years ago, he almost lost the church due to an outstanding water bill.
So we had accrued this nearly $7,000 water bill. We just took responsibility in light of deadlines and timing issues. We took responsibility for the water bill. We said we'll pay it. We made an arrangement to pay it in installments. But because we were left naked on the other end, not being informed about an old, outdated environmental fee, we were still thrown into tax sale. We heard no more about it until we were facing foreclosure. And because the congregation is small, there was no way in the world that we had the monies. I had just depleted my own reserves.
And how did you get the church back?
Well, I prayed. We faced a writ of possession, and then with the writ of possession came an eviction notice. And so we spent the night here. We rented a truck. We were packing up 30 years of our lives here as a ministry and as a staple in the community. What we found is that the court ruled 13 minutes before the 10 o'clock eviction. 9:47, the call comes through that the judge has granted us to stay the eviction. Well, you know that it was time to roll out the barrel.
That was a good day for you then.
A great day.
Great day.
An ecstatic day. We were really happy. And so we unpacked, and then we gave thanks.
People have been evicted from entire blocks in this part of Baltimore. It's unclear exactly why, but what is clear, few people around here have the means to pay anything outstanding.
Of course, there's a lot of despair. There's a lot of displacement behind losing your life investment. Right? What's more precious than the place where you lay your head? And for a water bill, you have elderly people who are on fixed incomes who have to make the decision. Do I, pay for my prescriptions and for my food, or do I pay my water bill? There's not a lot of knowledge about the process. So then whatever recourse has been available, there's a deep need of education so that people understand that there's some recourse and there's some services available. There's free legal services to the elderly, but you have a fair mix of elderly people, low-income people who are really grossly challenged by water bills. And it's unethical because the water comes down from the heavens, and it is a basic human right. It's a basic human right, yeah.
Okay, let's chat more about the cost of water. Robert Glennon is still with us, and here on set I want to introduce Lauren Levitt, a climate change author, and Lewis Blaustein, who is a consultant and founder of Green Sports Blog. Now, firstly, I'd like to get, Robert, some more thoughts from you on this. Obviously, we looked at the film there in a case where people are either dipping into their life savings or having to face eviction just to pay a water bill. How common is it to see cases like this in America?
It's unfortunately increasingly common, Sally. Poverty is a major issue in the United States. The divide between rich and poor has never been greater. And it's very expensive to run a water system. And if you have a city like Flint with a declining population, there are fewer people to contribute to the water system. And without the federal government's support, it's just a real stretch for some people.
Now, Lauren, I wanted to bring you in here because I think a lot of people would be surprised to hear that climate change does play a role in the rising cost of water. What does the evidence say?
Well, on the East Coast, our infrastructure is stressed by the amount of rain we're getting. We're getting more rain in the past 5 years than we've ever received on the East Coast, versus the West Coast is plagued by drought. So there's an imbalance in the country. Our infrastructure is 100 years old. It's not designed to handle this amount of rain that climate change is causing.
Now, I want to bring Robert back from Arizona again. Robert, one of the discussions I had in Baltimore was that privatisation could potentially bring down the cost of water bills, but those who are anti that idea say that it could actually help them rise even further. What are your thoughts on this?
There is a role for the private sector and private resources. Local government can tap into the capital markets to raise funds for needed projects. So there is some possibility of doing that.
Okay, well, Robert, we'll have to leave it there for the time being. Thanks very much for your time. Let's look now at the wider issue of water pollution in America. Every year, 1.2 trillion gallons of untreated sewage, stormwater and industrial waste are discharged into US waterways. The result is that over 40% of America's rivers and lakes are too polluted for fishing, swimming or sustaining aquatic life, and entire ecosystems are affected. What would you say is the state of America's waterways?
They're not in good shape. We have too much plastic pollution, for instance, going into our waterways that we don't even see, and they are coming out of when we wash, they come from our synthetic fibers that we use, microbeads, and they're going into our water system, and our water treatment plants are not equipped to handle this. They need to be updated. Everything needs to be updated.
Lou, a recent study shows that Americans are more concerned about pollution in their drinking water rather than climate change itself. I would assume that those two are inherently linked, am I right?
Absolutely, Sally. The climate is universal and it affects everything. And when the climate is changing, everything is changing. And that's no different as it relates to water. For example, in addition to the plastic ocean problem, you also have a problem of soils that are not healthy, which is exacerbated by climate change, and the soil interacts with the water and there's a negative feedback loop.
Now, I want to talk more about the solutions and how the US can solve this huge problem of water pollution. I took a trip to Chesapeake Bay in Maryland to find out more about the unique success story there.
Chesapeake Bay, one of North America's biggest estuaries. Its many waterways sustain a vast range of ecosystems and livelihoods, but pollution from sewage, farm chemicals and suburban runoff led to a massive decline in the health of the bay, until scientists found a unique way of cleaning the water. Oysters. They're natural filter feeders, which means they pump water through their gills, trapping any sediment and chemicals. And they're also a popular product in this part of the country. Robert has been an oyster farmer for over 50 years. He used to harvest in the wild, taking what nature gave him. But in the last decade, many watermen started to rely on farming oysters, a practice known as aquaculture.
I've only been doing this farming for I guess about 7, 8 years again. I used to do it when I was younger, and then I didn't have no ground out in the river like this. The only ground I had into the creek we had right in front of my place, the house. I got a piece there, and that was all polluted. So when that was polluted, that kind of shut us out of that, and we went working just on the wild oysters.
How many of these do you usually fill a day then?
The other day we were out here, we had 15 in 3 hours.
Right.
But we've been that was from out where we were at first, but we've been working the ground kind of hard, and once you work it, once you take something from it, you got to wait for something to grow to get back.
Yeah.
Like all this stuff came out of tanks from the house. This stuff I do all my own. I go over to Horns Point and buy like 4 million larvae and put in one of the tanks, and that'll do about 190 bushel of shell.
Horn Point Oyster Hatchery is a bit like an oyster fertility clinic. It produces oysters by the millions for watermen like Robert to grow and farm. Many of these oysters also go to protected sanctuaries.
So these are our large larval tanks where we grow the oyster babies in here. 2016 and 17 were our two best years. We did about 1.8 billion spat back to the bay. 2018 we did about 1.3 billion. So the take home is we have ups and downs, and that's because Mother Nature is in charge.
In 1972, when America's Clean Water Act came into effect, the objective was to restore and maintain the chemical, physical and biological integrity of the nation's waters. But more than 40 years later, some waterways in the US are still so polluted that they struggle to support the aqualife and the people who depend on them. And until recently, Chesapeake Bay was one of them. But oyster restoration has played an important role in restoring the bay's health.
Oysters are very in demand right now. They're very much needed for their ecosystem services, the fish habitat and the water filtration aspect. We need those services to help clean up the Chesapeake Bay. At the same time, there's also another form of demand for the oysters, which is harvesting them. People like to see them on their dinner plates, and locally, culturally, they're very much a delicacy. So we're trying to establish a balance between those two things. And right now, in most parts of the Chesapeake Bay, that's being done by having certain areas set aside where large-scale oyster restoration can occur. We're physically rebuilding the reefs, planting oysters on top of them where it's needed, and allowing them to remain unharvested to provide those ecosystem services.
The Maryland Senate passed a bill to preserve the 5 large-scale oyster restoration projects. But it didn't come without pushback from oyster harvesters and some lawmakers who feel the sanctuaries infringe on commercial oyster production. And now, a new federal challenge may be on the cards. Trump has proposed to cut funds by up to 90% for the Chesapeake Bay program. What does that mean for the health of the bay?
So the Chesapeake Bay program funding funds everything from, it's a grant program to fund groups like CVF to work with farmers or local governments to reduce pollution, funds all the monitoring so we know whether we're making progress cleaning up the bay or not. So the good news is that the president's budget isn't the final say on the budget. Congress actually controls the budget, and cleanup in the bay has always been a bipartisan issue. Republicans and Democrats have literally supported it from the start, and so we're fairly confident that funding will be appropriated at the levels it was in the past, and in fact we're arguing for even more funding in the future because we feel like we're close to the finish line now, and now's the time to really accelerate our efforts, certainly not to roll them back.
How do you create that balance between conserving the water and the habitat within it, as well as the livelihoods of those watermen?
It's a challenge, and one of our more controversial issues that we delve into is always fisheries. There was some legislation in Maryland, for example, that was protecting oyster sanctuaries, and the watermen didn't like it because they felt like it was cutting off a lot of area that they could no longer harvest oysters from. So it's always a challenge to balance sort of the needs of the watermen, and they're out on the water every day, so we can't always just dismiss them because they're not scientists, because they have frankly more real world experience than a lot of the scientists who are telling them what to do.
For now, conservationists are winning the tug of war. But watermen like Robert, who've lived and worked on this bay their whole life, say they're not being listened to.
Anytime you plant oysters, it helps improve the environment because it helps filter the water and stuff. But that's only one of the things that the sanctuary network was set up for, was to help filter the water. Well, they got more oysters, but the oysters didn't come back naturally like they were saying were going to come back. In those areas where they have done it, they had to prove something, and it looks beautiful on paper. It looks beautiful when you see the photography of it, but it is not doing what it said it was going to do, help repopulate the bay.
So what do you love about what you do? Why do you do it?
Salt water got in my blood veins when I was a youngster, and that's...
Didn't leave.
It didn't leave.
Yeah. Salt through and through.
That's it.
Now, just talking to the waterman there, remembering the conversation we had about the record rainfall that he had earlier this year that basically led to a lot of deaths in terms of the oysters, which limits the recovery effort of the bay, but also his livelihood. I want to talk a little bit on a federal level here, Lou. The EPA, or the Environmental Protection Agency chief recently appointed by the Donald Trump administration, said that the focus on climate change and the need to limit warming would be detrimental to other environmental issues, such as clean water, but also affordable electricity. What do you say to this?
I strongly disagree. That is a part of a political playbook that tries to pit environmentalism and fighting climate change against economic health.
In terms of water pollution that's come from rural areas and, sewage and runoff, how much of that is actually affecting our waterways?
100%, because it goes right into our rivers. We have water that is treated, but our waterways, our rivers feed into our oceans, and it all affects. It's an entire systematic problem. Everybody can lower their plastic usage. Stop using plastic straws. New York City just banned plastic bags, and that should be done nationwide. It needs to be done nationwide. We're addicted to plastic, and it's become more ubiquitous in our society, I would say, since the 80s.
It'll be interesting to see how all of that changes. Thank you very much to both of you, Lou and Lauren.
Thank you.
Now, that's all the time we have for today on the show, but we'd love to hear your comments and questions on the issues discussed. You can contact us on Facebook and Twitter at TRT World and be part of the conversation. Now, thanks to our team here in New York, and please join us next time on The Square.